Zweig Group invites all AEC industry leaders to the 2024 AEC Small Business and Entrepreneurship Forum, the premier event for small firms in the AEC sector. Experience innovative strategies and insights on May 21st, crafted by Zweig Group's industry experts. Engage in keynotes and interactive sessions focused on recruitment, retention, and business growth. Join Zweig Group for this unique networking opportunity and take your business to new heights. Secure your spot today and be part of the AEC industry's future. Visit zweiggroup.com for more information. The Zweig Group team looks forward to welcoming you.
Welcome to the Zweig Letter Podcast, putting architectural, engineering, planning, and environmental consulting advice and guidance in your ear. Zweig Group's team of experts have spent more than 3 decades elevating the industry by helping AEP and environmental consulting firms thrive. And these podcasts deliver invaluable management, industry, client, marketing, and HR advice directly to you, free of charge. The Zweig Letter Podcasts, elevating the design industry one episode at a time.
Hey folks, and welcome to another episode of the Zweig Letter Podcast. I'm your host, Randy Wilburn, and I am here today with James Garrett Jr., one of the managing partners of Formula. It is a design firm based up in St. Paul, Minnesota, and I reached out to James a couple of weeks ago after all of the things happened up in Minnesota with George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter protest and everything that's been going on in this country. And as we are all dealing with the pandemic, we're dealing with racial issues here in this country. I thought it would be great to bring James on to the podcast to talk a little bit about his experiences, to talk about what he sees as the future of architecture in this space, and especially as it pertains to Black and brown individuals and those that are trying to break into the ranks of the design industry. And so without further ado, James Garrett, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thank you.
Yeah. So listen, I'd love for you just to kind of share with the audience a little bit about your, as I like to say, the superhero origin story or your background. You, as I learned a little bit more about you specifically, you are a multi-generational resident of the Twin Cities area. I think 5 generations or more that have been in that area. So you are from Minnesota and specifically from the Twin Cities. I'd love for you just to kind of share about your background and how you got to where you are today.
Yeah, certainly. I am a 5th generation St. Paulite. My great-great-grandmother moved to St. Paul, Minnesota, and she decided that, this was a place that she wanted to stay. She saw a future. She saw the early 1900s, late 1800s. She saw a place that she felt was progressive, and she felt like there were a lot of opportunities for people of color, particularly Black folks in St. Paul. And she decided she was going to put down roots and stay. And as we understand it, she was the first Black homeowner on Rondo Avenue, which was the heart of the Black community for several generations. It was unfortunately destroyed when Interstate 94 was built in the 1950s, and my family home was part of the eminent domain, as was my business partner, Nathan Johnson. Our grandparents were actually neighbors and grew up together on Rondo, and both of them had their houses taken via eminent domain and demolished. And that sort of dispersed the Black community. And so the Black community was very different when I grew up there. As a point of reference, I happened to be born in the United States Virgin Islands. My parents were after college at Michigan State. My parents moved to the Virgin Islands and they taught in the late 60s, early 70s. And ultimately, when I was little, we moved back here. When I was a baby, we decided to come back to what was, my mom's side of the family was home. And so I came back and I went to elementary school here, junior high, high school here. And at that time, I decided to go to the West Coast for my architectural education, my undergrad. And then I went to New York City for graduate school. And then, I keep being called back here. I keep ending up back here in St. Paul. And, we, after a brief stint in the Dominican Republic, where I met and married my wife, we decided to come back here in 2012 and continue with the business here. She's also an architect in her home country down in the Dominican Republic. So we formed a formula branch down there that we operated out of and did work out of during my stint down there. And then we finished up some projects and moved back to Minnesota for like the fourth or fifth time.
You can't get out of coming back to Minnesota.
Not for long. There's a real gravitational pull here for a lot of people. A lot of us, we find it really difficult to leave. Mm-hmm. It's a very family-oriented place. Tradition is important. History is important. In St. Paul, probably I'd say more so than Minneapolis. The cities are the twin cities, but they're fraternal twins at best that don't always get along.
Yeah.
So we're very close in geographic location. We border each other. Our histories are intertwined with one another, but the cities have evolved very differently, both generally and specifically for the Black communities. So St. Paul tends to be more conservative, more traditional. It's more about neighborhoods, churches, playgrounds. That's how St. Paul people kind of identify themselves. If you meet someone on an airplane, people want to know, everything from what hospital were you born in, to, what park did you play baseball at? That's right. How St. Paul people refer to each other. Whereas Minneapolis has always been, and St. Paul is the capital city, right? Cathedral, there's all the historic architecture. It's very sort of heavy and traditional and sort of stable in that way. Whereas Minneapolis is about finance, commerce, the velocity of transactions happening. It was a mill town, on the side of the Mississippi River that took advantage of the falls, the natural falls there. And they used the power of that water to mill the grain that would come up from the heartland, and it became Mill City, and it dominated its region. But it was about money, 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 and it reinvents itself every generation. And there's wild swings in terms of how things happen in Minneapolis. And Minneapolis will destroy all the history that they have in order to create the newest, biggest, best thing of this moment. And so there's an adventurousness in Minneapolis that St. Paul just doesn't have. Yeah. And I think in the spirit of the people, it's also the way that the city is formed and the way that things sort of manifest themselves in the city.
Yeah. I've spent time both in Minneapolis and St. Paul. I did a training at the Science Center, Science Museum that's right there on the Mississippi River. Beautiful facility. Yeah, beautiful. Yeah, beautiful facility. But even just walking down in that downtown area of St. Paul, it's very unique with the architecture that you see and experience there. And it does feel different than Minneapolis. From that perspective. I'd love for you just to talk a little bit about you didn't get into architecture by accident. And there's a couple of things I want to talk about because I want to get to the George Floyd incident because that was one of the things that really sparked it. But I think honestly, if George Floyd had never happened, I would want to talk to you just about this whole idea. But now is it great grandfather was one of the city architects for St. Paul?
My grandpa's godfather. My grandfather was James S. Griffin, and his godfather was Clarence Cap Wigington. And Cap Wigington was the city architect in this town for about 40 years. And he designed an amazing number of buildings and structures from like the 19 teens through the 1950s. And he designed my grandparents' home, that I spent a lot of time growing up in. He designed my grade school, which I didn't know at the time until I was an adult, a building that I love very much in the Art Deco style. He designed the Highland Park Water Tower, which is one of the iconic structures in the city of St. Paul. In the Highland Park neighborhood, he designed a number of schools, park buildings. There's a pavilion named after him in downtown St. Paul along the river that he designed. So just a prolific architect. He designed the St. Paul Airport, Holman Field. He's legendary. He's really one of two or three architects that are super well known here and that have a number of buildings on the historic register. But he's one of them.
Yeah, and I guess if you were to go to St. Paul and spend any time there, you wouldn't even know that a Black person had their thumbprint on the design and aesthetic of that city the way he did.
Nope. And it was actually in denial for many years here. After he left and retired and moved to California, a lot of it was forgotten. A lot of his accomplishments were sort of covered up. Some were forgotten about. There was a sort of a disinformation campaign basically to try to write him out of history to some degree. And my grandfather was very instrumental in using his platform as a city leader. 42 years in the police department. He was a deputy chief of police. He was on the school board for 16 years here in St. Paul. And he had a platform. He was very well known in the community. And he dug up a bunch of archival information and a bunch of drawings that had, Uncle Cap's signature on them. And, he was very adamant about representing this story that he knew his godfather was the city architect because he was his godfather and he looked up to him and he knew what he was doing in all the buildings that he had designed and that had his name and his architect's signature written on them. And so after exhaustive research by actually one of my staff members, Lissa Washington, her uncle, her uncle David Taylor, who was the General Studies, the College of General Studies president at the University of Minnesota for many years here. He actually wrote the book on Uncle Cap and documented everything. And so it became indisputable that that he had actually designed all these incredible buildings. He documented them. He listed them. He listed them in order. And the city of St. Paul then at that point started to really, lean in and really start to celebrate the fact that we had the first Black municipal architect in the United States was here, and it became kind of a source of pride. And so I was at a ceremony where they brought some of his descendants together and they dedicated a park building to him, one of the buildings that he designed. And a number of other things like that. We started the architects organization that I was a part of, started a scholarship in his name. We're never going to let that legacy be forgotten now, but it's been documented. It's there. It's in writing and it's irrefutable now. So.
Yeah, I love that. And I'm going to have to get that. What is the title of that? Is an architectural history in ice and what?
Ice and Stone.
Ice and Stone. I love that. Yeah, I'm going to make sure we put that in the show notes because I think people need to see that. So, And I always say this. I mean, people need to see other people that look like them do something in order for them to realize that they can do it too. And I'm speaking specifically. So for you as a young African American, with the knowledge of this history, and it hasn't been lost on me what you told me about your grandfather being the deputy chief of police, and I'm going to get to that in a second. But for you, as someone that decided that ultimately, how old were you when you realized you wanted to get into architecture?
It's interesting because I've wanted to be an architect since before I knew that there was a word to describe it.
Wow.
So I'm talking kindergarten, maybe younger.
Yeah.
I always loved playing with Lincoln Logs, Legos, building anything with anything I could get my hands on, but building stuff. And I was always fascinated with skyscrapers. And I always wanted to, go to the observation deck of skyscrapers. I was so obsessed with skyscrapers and drawing skyscrapers and buildings that when I was 12, my parents discovered a notebook of mine that I'd been keeping where I'd been just drawing all these crazy visions of new buildings that didn't exist. And I was drawing all the buildings to scale in downtown Minneapolis, downtown St. Paul. My parents were like, oh, wow. Oh, okay. So this is really a thing.
Yeah.
So after they discovered that notebook, they had to talk with me and they said, let's go on a family trip to Chicago. Chicago has a lot more buildings than the Twin Cities does. And, we could just go look at buildings in Chicago. And I was like, really? And so we made a road trip. We went to Chicago and they took me to the Sears Tower. We went to the observation deck, the John Hancock building, and went to the observation deck, Water Tower Place, so I became obsessed with Chicago and they bought me a book of Chicago architecture. So then I was obsessed with Chicago buildings too, and could tell you how tall, to the tallest floor of the highest point of the Sears Tower, which is obviously now the Willis Tower. But, those were things that, I was able to obsess over. And there was no doubt, there was no turning back. It was something that, I knew at a very young age that I wanted to do. And architecture fever for me just got, worse and worse and worse the older I got,
Yeah.
So it was, there was only really one path that I could ever remember thinking.
Yeah. And you said you went to a fairly diverse high school, but that you encountered some challenges as you tried to express your love for architecture, right? Because I mean, you were kind of pigeonholed into taking some shop classes in order to prove your worth to even get into an architectural program within your high school. Is that correct?
That is correct. I went to an extremely diverse high school. It was majority minority high school back in the 80s. Even at that time, and there was a division though in my high school where the AP classes and the Quest gifted and talented classes and the international baccalaureate classes were all on the upper floor of the building, and the lower 3 levels of the building were basically, the other classes, right? And so there was this weird sort of vertical social class differentiation thing going on. And you don't really realize it as a kid, but, most of my courses were, AP and IB and gifted and talented. That was a track that I'd been on since first grade. Mm-hmm. In the way that the city handles their gifted and talented programs here. And so it was very normal for me to be up on the 5th floor taking all these classes. But it was very odd that I had very few other students, Black and brown students, that were in these classes. But then when I'd go to lunchtime, recess, sports, super diverse. And I wasn't able to really put it all together at the time, sort of what was going on. But there was this sort of form of sort of class differentiation that was happening then. And I think my first real run-in with the clash to that was when I wanted to take the architecture class. There was only one architecture course. It wasn't really well known or anything. But there was a teacher that, was teaching architecture, and they were building little models and houses and stuff like that. And I saw that one day and I was like, I want that. That's where I want to be. And so I inquired, like, how do I get in this class? And, they came up with all these excuses and reasons why I couldn't be in the class. And so when I brought my parents up there, because I could not understand, and my parents were obviously huge advocates of education, they're both master's degree holders. My mother was, a public school administrator for 30 plus years here in St. Paul Public Schools. So they were very confused as to why I couldn't take that course as well. So there was a compromise that was struck that said, if you take these machine drafting courses and you do enough machine parts, you draft up enough machine parts, then, you could come in and you can take some of the architecture classes. And so then I thought, okay, well, I guess that's reasonable. Sometimes there's prerequisites. I don't think it was written anywhere, but they just said that this is what you had to do. So I said, oh, okay, I can do that. Yeah. But I didn't realize that the number of machine parts and that they needed me to qualify as a prerequisite to get into the class was beyond what could be accomplished really during my high school career. I mean, and I'm sure they knew that, but it was the Minnesota nice, soft way of saying absolutely not without ever saying absolutely not. And so once I kind of, I took that course for a few semesters, and once I realized numerically and mathematically that I'm going to graduate before I ever reach this magical, mysterious number, and then I kind of lost my taste for it. I was very disappointed, and it was just something I was kind of disgusted by. And, I decided to take other classes and focus on, I figured I'd take architecture in college, and, I would just deal with it at that point. But of course, when I started architecture school in college, most of my classmates had taken architecture drafting and architectural model making, architectural courses in their high schools in California and elsewhere. So I was behind the eight ball. I was underprepared. I had to do a lot of catching up. And, it really forced me to focus and to really, sharpen my sword. But, I think not every student might be able to catch up. Yeah. Some students might have been left behind by not being able to have the same preparation that the other students that they're going to be competing with that next year in college had already had. And so that was my first realization that this was going to be a really uphill battle in this profession, and that at every step along the way, there were pitfalls and sort of mines set up to blow up in my way to divert me towards something more attainable or less difficult to attain. And I think that I know that those things are still happening in architecture schools all across the country. And I know that the gross disparity that we have in terms of the number of African-American architects in this country compared to our percentage of the population is directly related to, all of the obstacles that are set in young people's paths that discourage them from competing and continuing on in this career.
Yeah, I mean, as you say that, and I'm sitting here and I'm walking through that, and I'm thinking, man, so when people say, well, how come we don't have more Black architects? How come we don't have more people of color in the design space? And then you start to think, well, if there were roadblocks from high school, roadblocks in undergrad, roadblocks in graduate school, you start to begin to understand the challenges that design professionals or wannabe design professionals face of color that want to operate in this space.
And then there's a number of those roadblocks. Once if you're able to matriculate through and you're able to make it into the professional ranks, our profession is full of discouragement, limited opportunity for you, and microaggressions and worse. And I've had to sort of contend with all of those things in order to make it to the point that I'm at. I've always had an entrepreneurial spirit, but I think it took me working in corporate architecture for just a few years to really realize that if I'm ever going to get to the point where I'm able to express myself and to really share my full talent and ability, it's certainly not going to happen within the confines of the way that the architecture industry is currently set up. And that, I was very motivated to start my own practice and to try to do things in ways that I felt were best practices in the industry and were more equitable and more just for the employees and staff that we've had come through our doors over the years. We've learned the hard way from having worked in the industry and seen some of these things firsthand. And there's a lot of things that we learned, positive lessons in terms of, ways to sort of organize and structure organizations. But we also learned a lot of what not to do. And I think those are equally as important.
Yeah. And I got to believe, though, that something happened on the afternoon or early evening of May 25th, 2020, that will ultimately impact how we move things forward. And I'm obviously speaking of the George Floyd incident that took place in Minneapolis. And, I think we're riding this wave right now, right? Especially as African Americans. You're Black, I'm Black. So we're riding this wave of, okay, everybody is recognizing that we've got a long way to go. And you've experienced it with, as you said, the Minnesota Nice effect that does exist, and how that pervades or happens or impacts or informs how African Americans are treated, especially in the design industry space. But where are we able to go? What have we been able to, I guess the best way to put it, since George Floyd's death? What door has that opened up for us to move into with regard to what we ask for, what we want to do, especially as design professionals?
That's a great question. I think about that a lot, and I think it's too early to tell. At this point, I'm not convinced that anything has substantively changed that would lead to qualitatively better outcomes than what we've been sort of receiving and experiencing for the past, 150 years in this profession. There's a lot of talk, which is great, but there was a lot of talk before. And it hadn't led to any concrete action or material action. Ultimately, we're going to need a massive redistribution of resources in this country in all aspects and all facets of American life if we are to actually move ourselves into the direction that I think is most positive for everyone, quite frankly. But if we're really going to look at Black people and, our troubled history in this country, in this continent, in this hemisphere, and other marginalized groups, if we're going to actually make progress, real substantive progress, it's going to take a massive redistribution of resources. The way that resources are sort of allocated here in this country cannot continue to be allocated and aimed at a very narrow band of people, and to the detriment of really everybody else. I think that's the fundamental thing. With that, we won't need the platitudes in the words, right? If we had resources to build our own businesses and take our own initiatives, and if we had the funding for our own organizations that, are doing great work, but if we could force multiply that by really getting behind some of the community groups and community-led initiatives that we already have, having the resources available to start new initiatives to directly target some of the inequities and some of the issues that we've already identified. If we had access to that, a lot of this stuff could really, we could really make progress towards, moving into a post craziness era and into a more equitable, just future. But without the resources, the conversations, are great, but it doesn't really move the dial. Moving the dial requires action, and direct action in terms of really reallocating resources and funds and opportunity in this country. And I'm not 100% sure that this country is ready for that. Mm-hmm. I share the hope with each generation that for my kids, the work that we do, hopefully the work that we do will serve my children and their generation, and that they'll be able to move into a society that's much better prepared to deal with diversity of thought, idea, and cultural heritage than we currently are.
Yeah. You talked about, I read an article that you were featured in, and you talked about that there's, in your mind, there's a 3-step approach that formula takes, and that you think that this is something that all architects can actually employ. And as you said, to achieve more equitable and inclusive outcomes. Would you be able to kind of just give us the framework for this 3-step approach and how it plays into or informs what you guys are going to do specifically? Because I know you can only speak for yourself, but.
Yeah, certainly. Formula is really based on 3 fundamental principles: technology, environmental sustainability, and art. Those are the 3 fundamental premises that we have built this company on. And our goal is to have community impact, and leveraging these 3 things in order to maximize the impact that we can have on the communities that we serve. So really the first step, the way that I sort of proselytize this, is setting up diverse, talented, broadly qualified teams, right? Being able to partner with people that are different than yourself, being able to place community artists at the center of the process, and being able to have them at the table with the architects and the engineers and everybody else, that they are part of the design team. They're integrated into the design team. They are an essential part of the process moving forward. I'm also a visual artist and an advocate for the arts. And there are skills and talents and a particular type of vision that artists can bring that other people really don't have. They're able to see things and see opportunities for expression, for connection, for engaging in ways that most of us just we don't have that. We're not equipped to be able to do that. So being able to making commitments to be able to bring those types of folks, diverse community artists, to the table on your project teams, forming diverse teams, experientially diverse, ethnically diverse, culturally diverse, and being able to have those teams then attack design opportunities. To me, that's the fundamental part. As a former athlete, you got to have the right team. You got to have the right composition of the squad. If it's a basketball team, everybody can't be 8 feet tall and everybody can't be 4 feet tall, right? You need different people with different attributes and different skills to play each position if you're going to be able to successfully move the ball, up the court, defend your basket, and be able to score baskets, right? So for me, fundamentally, being able to put together broadly diverse in terms of talent and experience and sort of ethnic makeup, being able to put those teams together and leverage the power of that diversity. To me, that's the biggest step that you can take. And to me, that's the natural first step that we always take whenever we're responding to a request for qualifications or a request for proposals. We always try to really be broad thinking about how do we bring the best possible most diverse, broadest based squad together to be able to tackle the challenges that are in front of us. The second thing that we do once that team is in place, we like to basically leverage art, sort of employ art as a means of stakeholder engagement. So being able to work with the artists that are on your team to be able to really engage, not just with the owner or the client, but with the end users, with the community, community organizations, all different types of folks that are going to be affected by whatever it is that you do, and to be able to really engage in authentic ways. And I think having artists at the table and artists as part of that process, they can really create events that are fun, that are engaging, that you can really start to host conversations that you normally can't really host, right? A survey or a spreadsheet or, a checklist does not engage in the level of qualitative dialogue that is necessary to really push things forward and to create possibilities that weren't there before, right? The only thing you can do if you're sort of spreadsheet oriented and checklist oriented, which our society unfortunately leans far too much in that direction, the only thing you can do is basically replicate what you've already done. And if you're mired in the abject mediocrity of the built environment that we currently have, replicating that failure essentially over and over again is not a pathway towards a more equitable and inclusive and just future. So we don't engage in it. So that is step two. It's being able to really engage with folks in a creative, arts-based way and be able to really dig deep and get a higher level of understanding of what the challenge is, but also what the opportunities in front of you are. The third piece of that is we like to deploy art sort of as a design outcome, right? So as you go through this process, as you're getting to know folks, you're getting to know what their needs are, what their hopes, their dreams, their aspirations are, to be able to have that engagement with the visual artists on your team, to be able to start to create unique, authentic artworks that speak to that process, that speak to those discoveries, to speak to the outcomes of those conversations, and to be able to integrate those into the actual architecture, to really create integrated architecture and buildings that are reflective of the community and of these qualities that are unique to this particular site, this particular time in history. Those three things, being able to put those three things together in relevant, meaningful ways, lead to qualitatively better outcomes in terms of the built environment. So I stand on that. I lecture on that. I travel all over the country speaking about this. I speak at AIA conferences, state architects conferences, universities. It's one of the things that I try to impress to the young people that come through the University of Minnesota program that I contribute to here as well. So I think there's a generation that's very receptive, a burgeoning generation in Gen Z, the Zoomers that are really sort of starting to have their impact felt on the world, inside and outside of academia and in the streets right now. But I feel like there's a generation there that is very receptive to the concept of doing things differently and reaching for qualitatively superior results rather than just replicating the mediocrity and the failures of the past.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, you kind of laid it out perfectly. So I think, if you get to play a part in this creation of something better than what has been experienced in the Twin Cities, is it something that you think is going to inform what happens both in Minneapolis and in St. Paul? Or is because you call them fraternal twins, so that means that there are unique aspects to both areas. So how will that play into this? And are you going to have any part, or do you hope to have a part in how Minneapolis creates something new out of the hurt and the pain that has come from this George Floyd situation?
Well, I really believe that what we're dealing with is something that is universal. I mean, we're seeing statues of slave owners being tossed into the ocean in Europe and all over. There is a global undercurrent that the dismantling of the white supremacy system that we've been living under for the last 500 to 600 years it's long overdue. And it's not just limited to what's happening in Minneapolis, and it's not at all separate from the struggles that we have, here in St. Paul. To me, we're doing work in both cities. We have clients on both sides of the river, and we have staff and partners that are from both sides of the river. So we are definitely fully engaged in this battle on both sides here simultaneously. And I think what we're looking to do is create something that's more equitable, something that's more just, something that's more inclusive, and something that's more reflective of the experiences, the cultural backgrounds, and able to celebrate the commonalities and the differences that folks of all communities have, and to be able to do so through the built environment, through the way that we occupy space. We've designed parks and pocket parks, open spaces, all different types of structures. And one of the common threads is that, our built environment no longer really reflects who we are, and where we want to go anymore. And I think that was lost at some point post World War II through sort of the modern movement and sort of this elimination of decoration and detail in the architectural work. And really, after the Art Deco movement ended, right at around the time World War II took place, there was a loss of, all major building projects used to have an consulting artist. There was always an architectural artist that was on board to work on, whether it's integrating sculpture, frieze, mural, fresco, carving columns and pilasters, and, really creating, telling a story, a visual story through the act of building. And that was something that was lost. That was something that, I really studied very closely and carefully, and something that I want to bring back in sort of a 21st century version, with attention to environmental sustainability and sort of ecological resilience, with sort of an emphasis on technology and being able to leverage technology to both execute the work, but then also to express that technology in ways to enhance the experience of the buildings for the clients and the end users. So leveraging those two things in the form of artistic expression that's based on sort of a 21st century future forward aesthetic. But that spirit of having that artist at the table and those people that their job is to look for those opportunities to express those hopes, dreams, and aspirations of the folks around us. To me, that's something that's essential, that has always been a part of the built process. You go back to ancient Egypt, ancient Rome, Mesopotamia. All of the buildings were expressive of, different sculptural aspects, different colors and textures and materiality. That was something that goes back to the very beginning. And it's something that I think we lost in error after World War II. And it's something that it's about time that it comes back in this moment more than ever. We need that expression. We need the built environment to communicate who we are, who we aspire to be, and all of those aspects moving forward. So we're going to continue to do that. It's in our DNA here at Formula. And, we're going to keep continuing to encourage and try to inspire future generations to think a little bit differently about the built environment, and to make that built environment a place that, again, it's more equitable, it's more just, and it's more expressive of the folks that live in the communities that these buildings are taking shape in.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. As I was sitting here listening to you talk, it helped me to think. I studied Gothic and Romanesque architecture in college at one point in time. I thought I was going to get into art history, but I didn't. Long story. But the bottom line is I remember I lived over in Europe for a while and just studying buildings. And I can remember people talking about, well, you can walk into certain buildings and some buildings almost feel like they have a soul about them. And you can actually feel it. And then you get into some places that are just very sterile and there's just nothing that emanates from it at all. And I think a lot of what you're talking about is design with soul, which I think will be really interesting, because I think art informs life and life informs art. And I think the two of them are inclusive together, and they're not exclusive. They're not separate from each other. So,
yeah, I believe very much in different theories of embodied energy, right? That the amount of energy, of organization, of effort, of thought, of care that you put into the design, the planning, the construction of a building, that energy remains in that space and it emanates outward, and you can feel it when you go into, I was in Notre Dame Cathedral before the fire, years ago in Paris. You can feel it there. I've climbed Mayan pyramids and ruins, at Chichen Itza, at Tikal, in Mesoamerica. And when you're sitting, on top of Templo Numero Cinco in the middle of the rainforest, you can feel something. There is definitely something emanating and vibrating there. And I'm a believer that energy, that effort, that collective community spirit that it took to create some of these things, the thought process that it took, the planning effort, the logistics, all that energy to create these monuments, these things that speak to us through the millennia, that energy, that embodied energy, it's there, and it doesn't dissipate. It's there, and you can feel it and you can sense it when somebody really cares about a space, when somebody really puts heart and soul and spirit into an effort like that. It's there, and there's no comparison between that and what we have in sort of the international style of building that sort of came into popularity post World War II, where everything was about efficiency. Everything was about using the minimum amount of energy and effort and materials available, right? That's why a lot of these structures and a lot of these bridges collapse. They weren't built with that redundancy and that rigidity and that richness. Everything was built paper thin to these minimal margins to look good on spreadsheets and, to justify, the disinvestment in our cities that was very prevalent, especially in the late 70s and 80s with the conservative movement and the anti-tax movement and defund everything meaningful movement, right? That came through, the forces that elected Ronald Reagan and all this conservatism, right? Those were all about doing the bare minimum. Those were all about just good enough and no more. It was all about don't waste any money on anything extra. Don't invest any money in people, right? It was the bare minimum, the most highly efficient, and the thing that looks best on a spreadsheet, quite frankly. And it's been a disaster. It's been a disaster. Pre-war buildings are generally worth the investment in terms of renovating and fixing and, giving some love to. Post-war buildings, I mean, there's no character. There's a lot of times they have, again, minimal structural systems. You'd have to spend so much money trying to reinforce the structure to be able to, even accept, an additional floor or a modern renovation that requires different types of material finishes and equipment than they did back then, that you almost have to start over with a lot of these things because, it doesn't justify that type of investment. It just wasn't built with foresight. It wasn't built to last for a long time / forever like it used to be. It was built to be the minimum thing, built the fastest, to serve the most people in the shortest period of time, and then we'll figure out the rest of it later. Well, we're 50 to 60 years into that experiment now, and we have massive replacement of bridges, tunnels, airport facilities, infrastructure that has to be done because these things, they weren't built to last. And we really have a wholesale rethinking to do, quite frankly, of our entire built environment.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, obviously that one way you can look at it is it certainly is job security for design professionals as far as that's concerned. But no, there is a lot more to it. I want to just circle back to one thing, and it's something that's come up lately in a lot of my conversations. And I know that you said that your grandfather was the deputy chief of police, and I'm curious how this whole thing with George Floyd has impacted you from that perspective. Now, I even understand that you may have even come in contact with him. Not that you went in the same circles, but that you used to go to a restaurant or a place where he used to work. And so you had maybe met him a few times, but how has this impacted you from that perspective?
Yeah, I mean, it's devastating. It's always devastating every single time. It just so happened that, he was, regular fixture at the front door, working security at a restaurant and nightclub that I frequented for years. And, I knew him just as Big Floyd, like so many other of us did, sort of in that sort of circle, in that sphere. And so it's devastating to lose somebody that was beloved by everybody. No one ever had said a bad word about him that I knew. He was well respected, didn't have any problems with anybody as far as any of us knew. So, I mean, it's devastating to see a loss like that, and someone that has a family and, was really beloved in that circle, in the Latin music scene, in the Twin Cities here. So yes, I mean, there's a direct effect there. There's also the reality that my family history, my grandfather was named deputy chief of police here in 1972, which was the year that I was born. And he served for 42 years as a police officer. He helped build sort of the modernized police department that we have now. His people that he brought in and that he mentored and that he trained have become chiefs of police now here, and really represent some of the values and some of the initiatives that he brought to bear during his time. And so I am very close with St. Paul Police. I was on the police commission that selected the most recent chief, Chief Axtell, who's a wonderful guy, and also part of that sort of legacy of tradition that goes back from my grandfather and some of the influence that he had. And I think St. Paul Police do things very differently than the Minneapolis Police. We certainly have our challenges, and we certainly have plenty of problems, but I feel like we're about 50 years into some changes and a different way of policing, being more community-based, community-oriented, hiring and promoting people from the community, from within, to do the job of policing the communities that they live in. There's a lot of, I think, nuanced changes that St. Paul has made over these last couple generations. And I think we're quite a bit ahead in the process of reform and creation of a department that is more community oriented and more accountable to the community. Not without our problems, not without our challenges. God knows the 80s and 90s were a very difficult transition for us. And I experienced a lot of racial profiling. And I mean, that was really rampant back then during the crack era. And I think we've learned a lot of lessons from that. And I think we've implemented a lot of changes on the St. Paul side from that. I can't necessarily say the same for the way things are done in Minneapolis. They're done very differently. And I think Minneapolis has a great chief in place now, a local guy who grew up in the neighborhoods, grew up in the communities, and has a tremendous amount of respect from the citizenry. But there is a whole series of complications that are really preventing meaningful reform happening on the Minneapolis side. And like I said, I think they're just now starting to really grapple with things that my grandfather and, his successors had started to grapple with, 40, 50 years ago.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, I certainly don't envy Minneapolis with the challenges that are ahead of them. But you know what they say, it does take a village, right? So, I mean, everybody's got to get involved and be a part of the change that everybody wants to see. And so I'm certainly sorry for your loss from the perspective that you knew George Floyd. And I can only imagine when you saw that video, you recognized him right away. And I think that's the real conversation that I've been having with people, because I get calls from a lot of my white friends. How are you doing? I get calls from other friends too, but I think sometimes people don't realize the level of pain which can be experienced through a situation like this, even if you don't even know the person. It's still there, as an African American, as a Black or brown person, you struggle with that. And coming from an area like the Twin Cities that has a huge Black and brown population. I mean, you've got a huge group of people, a Hmong population there, one of the largest in the world outside of where they're originally from, Laos. And thank you. And then also a huge Somali population that's right there. And so, I mean, you've got a lot. I mean, you've got like the Germans call it a Schmelztiegel, a melting pot, right? It doesn't always melt properly, but that's what you have in the Twin Cities. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see how things come, but it still is a challenge. And, and I'd be curious to see what you're telling young Black and brown design professionals that are coming up now in terms of what they need to be focused on.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's a wonderful thing to have an influx of newcomers, to have a place that is so highly coveted that new folks, generation after generation, keep wanting to sacrifice to be here. Mm-hmm. I think it's a huge advantage to have. And I think it speaks volumes about sort of what we've done, although imperfect, what we've done over time to build up this place. I also think it's a wonderful opportunity because with diversity comes diverse viewpoints, diverse talents. You get a number of different folks looking at the same problems that may have new solutions or new ideas that come from their traditions and their cultures that may be blind spots for the rest of us. And so I think it's refreshing. I think it's great. I think it is ultimately the competitive advantage that America has over the world, that we have this diversity. And, we've been at this experiment for, hundreds of years now. But to me, that's the biggest advantage that we have. When we do it right, the sky is really the limit. When we do it wrong, we have a lot of conflict and sort of petty bickering over limited, scarce resources. So right now, in this moment, we're definitely doing it wrong. But I see little microcosms and little pockets and areas and organizations and communities that these factors come together, and the sum of the parts creates something really wonderful. And, Lake Street which has been decimated, a huge stretch of Lake Street, which was ground zero for the civil unrest in Minneapolis, was a great example of that. For the past really 30, 40 years, Lake Street has become a very diverse melting pot of all different groups and ethnicities of people. You could get any kind of food from, Mesoamerica, Africa, Ethiopian injera to, Indian naan bread to, authentic Mexican tacos, just in a block of each other, right? It was a great, real, authentically diverse, organically diverse group of people, group of businesses, group of neighbors. And so it's devastating on one hand that this had to happen there. But on the other hand, I think there's a great possibility of being able to come together with all of these different groups and all of these different folks and creating something that is forward thinking and even better than what they inherited. Because quite frankly, all of us, African American folks that have been in this country for generations, a lot of the old buildings, these historic buildings that we sort of hold in esteem, that are just kind of old and they're in the community and we think highly of them, those neighborhoods were not Black neighborhoods then. Yeah. Those buildings were not designed by Black people. Those buildings were not built by Black contractors and construction workers, right? A lot of those buildings didn't really accept Black people coming in and shopping and working in those spaces. They weren't open to us until very recently. And generally when a previous group of folks has moved on into some suburban enclave that they created post-World War II or whatever, and then sort of leaving those buildings for us to sort of inherit, right? And then, now Black people and immigrants and other people can inhabit these spaces and occupy these spaces and do business in these spaces. But those spaces were never designed for us. They were never designed by us. They were never built by us. So with this challenge comes an opportunity to actually, for the first time for a lot of us, to actually define what a building or a space that serves our population, our group of people, the way that we live culturally, the way that we organize ourselves and do things. What does a building that you're not inheriting, but that you're actually creating from scratch, that can now serve you and your vision in a very unique and authentic way? What does that look like? What does that feel like? What are the characteristics of that? What do communities look like that are rebuilt in a diverse image rather than sort of a very sort of monoculture image, right? So those are all opportunities that are coming from the challenges that we face. But I think it comes back to the question of resources. Are there going to be resources deployed? And are those resources that are going to be deployed, are they going to reach people that look like us, that look like my Somali friends, that look like, my Ecuadorian friends, that look like my Ethiopian friends, or is it going to go to the same group of people that it went to in the beginning? And I mean, is that cycle going to just continue? And so those are real fundamental questions that we're going to have to answer. And although there's, I believe, infinite possibility, that possibility is pragmatically tethered to access to resources.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. I mean, you put it very succinctly in terms of what we can expect. And I would say that what we will see in the next 5 to 10 to 15 years, especially up in your area, is going to inform what we probably see in other parts of the country as well. So I think that's going to be, it's going to be an interesting challenge, and you're right in the thick of it. So, man, I have nothing but hope for you and your organization and for what you're doing. And I really appreciate you taking time to kind of bear all today, and a lot was shared. So thank you so much for coming on the podcast and giving us your view of current events, as well as what has happened in the past and what will happen in the future. I'd love it if you would be willing to share what's a good way for people to get in touch with you if they'd like to reach out, James.
Yeah, I think the best way for people to reach out is either on LinkedIn or on Instagram. Those tend to be the places where I spend quite a bit of time these days. My Instagram is 4RMULA_ARCH, Formula Arc. And that's my personal Instagram. And then our company Instagram is 4RMULA_architects. So I can generally be reached at either of those two locations. And then you can find us very easily on LinkedIn. You can search for me by name, or you can search for Formula.
Sure.
And I get all those messages.
Okay. Well, perfect. Yeah, we will do that. And we'll also link to the Formula website. And that way, anybody that's listening to this podcast that wants to reach out and connect with James, maybe to have you come and speak or to have you share, I think that you have there's a wealth of possibilities there, and certainly I'm sure you're going to be in quite some demand, not only with what you're currently working on within your organization, but also externally helping other design firms figure out and find their way when it comes to this area. So I wish you nothing but the best, and I thank you so much for sharing with me. And I mean, I could talk to you for hours. We did talk for like a half an hour before we even started this podcast, talking about sports and a whole bunch of other stuff. And it's so funny how two people that have never met each other have so many things in common, but it's all good. So I appreciate that. And again, from the bottom of my heart, I thank you. And certainly we will be watching with bated breath to see what the next iteration is for you and Formula Architects. And certainly if there's anything that we can do, please feel free to let us know.
I will, and I appreciate you inviting me for this conversation, and look forward to the next one.
Yeah, thank you so much. Well, folks, there you have it. It's another episode of the Zweig Letter Podcast. It's a heavy one. We covered a lot of topics, and James is just an outstanding individual. I encourage you to check out the show notes and reach out to him, even just for a word of encouragement. We can all use that in this day and age, and especially during this time and season that we're in here in the United States. And I appreciate all of you guys that listen to the Zweig Letter Podcast on a regular basis. Remember, if you'd like to get a free subscription to the Zweig Letter, just visit thezweigletter.com and check it out. You can sign up right there. There is no requirement. We just need your email address, and every Monday morning you'll get a nice new PDF with an updated newsletter telling you everything that's happening in the design industry. Remember, the Zweig Letter Podcast is here for you, and we come out every other week on Thursday. And we appreciate you guys being a part of the Zweig Letter family. Remember, we exist not just to make you more successful, but to elevate the industry. Each and every one of us, black, white, brown, tan, white, doesn't matter. We're trying to elevate the industry as a whole. And so that's all that we have for you this week. I'm your host, Randy Wilburn, and I will see you soon. Peace.
Thanks for tuning in to the Zweig Letter Podcast. We hope that you can be part of elevating the industry and that you can apply our advice and information to your daily professional life. For a free digital subscription to the Zweig Letter, please visit thezweigletter.com/subscribe to gain more wisdom and inspiration, in addition to information about leadership, finance, HR, and marketing your firm. Subscribe today.